Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. What if blood relationships are capable of betrayal? Can we ever have complete faith in this world? The moment that caused the world to stop Rick Harrison, the dazzling porn star admitted in court to crime that caused the courtroom to become immobile. He was shocked to learn that he had killed his Richard Harrison, the beloved's own father figure that millions of spectators adore. His admission felt icy and piercing, blade cutting through what appears to be the ideal American family, that the country once loved, what may have caused Rick to transgress such a moral boundary. Was it a festering case of unquenchable greed, animosity, or a scheme derived from the soul's darkest recesses? There are even more terrible revelations in store. To be uncovered, come along on a relaxing adventure. To learn the harsh reality, share your ideas in the comments section below. Like us and follow the channel to stay up to date, investigating this intriguing situation in greater detail during a period when time itself seems to. The courtroom in Las Vegas is motionless, fell into a dreadful silence that was broken solely by the startled onlookers' gasps. Rick Harrison, the dazzling porn stars that millions of people once loved as a living representation of the American ideal, stood with his hands at the defendant's table. Shivering, they clutched the microphone. The face that formerly had a piercing grin when negotiating history TV gems had been warped with unimaginable. "I did it," he murmured in pain. Breaking like glass, "I terminated Richard Harrison, my father's." The confession smacked like a ton of bricks, causing shockwaves to explode through the jurors' mouths fell open in the courtroom. Some people are horrified and concealing their faces. Reporters rushed to document each, their pens trembling as they write. Even the experienced judge with notepads, who had observed innumerable offences, while his expression was one of unwavering incredulity, confront the gavel who was frantically beaten for order. But it was insufficient to stop the escalating. Outrage and bewilderment are on the rise. Via the Rick Harrison's room a few years ago was the epitome of his victory. Change the silver and gold porn. Transform a little store into ATV empire where each object conveyed a historical tale using his incredibly keen ability to negotiate and practical charisma. Rick brought to audiences all around the people think he was the ideal son. Standing next to his father with pride, Richard Oldman Harrison, in order to maintain the star's familial legacy, porn wasn't merely a demonstrate that it was a difficult sign of allegiance, family ties and employment. But now that picture has destroyed audiences' perceptions of admired has turned into a nasty stranger. They hardly recognize Rick's shadow. Confession did not only ruin his reputation, it destroyed the well-polished exterior that had concealed the Harrison. The terrible secrets of the family that had led to it was celebrity that blinded him to this abyss. Long been concealing flaws without anyone noticing, ventured to view the fissures inside the Harrison family didn't show up right away. They were brought about by decades of gradual resentment that burns like a little flame, that ultimately burst into an unmanageable previously. Wildfire Rick Harrison was regarded as the Richard Old Man, his father's right hand. Harrison had lived his whole life attempting to establish his value under the enormous iron-willed shadow patriarch. However, behind the dazzling porn star's relationship's success was a violent relationship between parent and son. Battlefield, where connections of blood were overtaken by bitterness, ambition, and ingrained injustice. Richard, a former member of the Navy, a stern manner consistently handled the pawn store for gold and silver as his personal, indestructible legacy. Notwithstanding, Rick had converted the small shop into a worldwide TV brand. Richard never gave him complete authority, as though Rick would always be merely a trainee. That injustice became apparent over time, and once more amid Richard's severe choices. 2015, when Rick suggested starting a new Los Angeles branch to profit from the enormous popularity of porn star, Richard gunned him down in public in front of the whole workforce is calling it a dumb idea, and said, "This store simply requires on leader, and it's definitely not you." Rick's pride was sliced by those comments like he had spent several nights with the knife, talks with television producers to bring the family name on the international scene. Veteran workers remembered Rick's departure, fists in the meeting room, pale-faced, tight, but yet putting a pressure on grin for the cameras and observe the pattern. Richard, openly and persistently repeated. Rick's sponsorship deals were criticized, secured, declined to raise his investment in the business, and even made threats to give transfer ownership to a different family member. If Rick was unaware of his position, as Richard's decline in health as a result of Parkinson's illness, their strain increased, significantly more intense in spite of Rick's handling. Nearly every day's activities of both the Richards store and the show both kept an iron grip, keeping an eye on everything. Cold clipped calls are especially, in 2017, there was a dramatic tipping point. When Rick learned that Richard had changed his will in secret, lowering Rick's bequest, and the transfer of a significant amount of the property into a Richard, is in charge of the charity trust himself during a private meeting at Richard's Weecat, their private residence, yet Rick appeared rebellious from his hospital bed. You're right in the eyes, too immature to continue this heritage. Those remarks weren't merely a rejection of, after years of selflessness, Rick was the final strike that made him angry, that was no longer able to be restrained. Financial conflicts broke out, and Rick wanted to be given 51% ownership of the store. Richard, however, declined, stating that the Harrisons' legacy will not be included in the hands of a person seeking money in the last few months, that Richard was too weak to get out of bed. His house turned into a field of legal wrangling. Attorneys came and went all the time, and Rick was charged with exerting pressure on his documents pertaining to power transfers will be signed by the father once he lost his entire lucidity. According to a witness, late one evening, Rick yelled at his dad, "I constructed all of this, but you never once acknowledged me." The feeling of unfairness Rick carried, in addition to growing financial constraints imposed by television contracts and debts from expansion, turned him become a loyal son, becoming a man who is fixated on power. The store, which was formerly a family icon, that devotion had turned into the flame that ate up all Rick had always valued. In Richard's latter months, as an elderly man, Harrison's life while suffering from Parkinson's confined him inside a deteriorating body. Rick Harrison had changed from being the submissive son who bowed to his father once. He had become a guy divided between allegiance and an unquenchable desire for power, plagued by restless evenings with melancholy thoughts, crept the crushing weight into his head of managing the pawn business for gold and silver, negotiating a TV deal worth millions of dollars, agreements, and fulfilling the requirements of millions of people saw Rick's shoulders. But the most intense ache originated from the understanding that regardless of how much, he gave up everything and was nothing more than a shadow beneath his dad's highlight. Each and every rejection that Richard's doubtful look was like a knife, as a continual reminder of Rick's never been genuinely recognized as the legitimate successor to the empire he possessed, contributed to the accumulation of animosity after many years, finally solidified into a cool, well-thought-out strategy. Rick with a keen. His imagination had previously assisted him in closing large-scale porn star transactions, started to plan every action with terrifying accuracy. He was aware that Richard had to die. A man's natural and uneventful end, whose corpse had already been destroyed by sickness, while he was visiting his Rick silently in his father's private house, examined Richard's dosages. He pored over Parkinson's medication, medical journals to understand how an modest but intentional overdose could accelerate the deterioration of a weak body, without casting doubt on that tragic evening when the earth was still. Thought Rick was the loving, devoted son. He made a meal for his sick father, more potent than normal, and agitated it. "This will assist you," Richard said into his water. "Slumber better," he said in a soft murmur. But Richard's eyes were chilly, exhausted and unwary, drank it all by. He was discovered dead in his bed in the morning. Passing that medical professionals ascribed to aging and sickness, Rick's scheme came to pass. Perfectly, he dialed the family attorney, prior to alerting the hospital, making sure that every legal document was present, to provide the shop complete control. Posts on social media had been carefully planned to create an image of a sorrowful son concealing the reality that he'd planned everything from the shadows, yet beyond that vicious guile was a guy plagued with guilt, that the ensuing restless evenings weren't out of fear of being discovered. They were troubled by recollections of a father who used to instructed him on the holding of his first ring, but who had also given him the impression that Rick told himself that he would never be good enough. It was Richard's gesture of kindness, would not have preferred to live in a suffering, but he knew in his heart that it was a falsehood. It was more than simply his father's demise, was a freedom that Rick purchased for himself at the cost of a treachery that cannot be forgiven. The demands of the workplace, from tense consultations with producers to uphold Rick's perfect public image, has turned. He used to be a stranger to himself, hoped that one day his father would give him a shoulder pat and tell him, "You did well." But that dream was never realized. Instead, he was driven by ambition and anger to choose a bad course of action. As later, he would admit in court that stunned everyone on the planet by not only took Richard's life, but launched a catastrophe that would devastate all that Rick had previously owned. Richard Oldman's last days. Dear Harrison was not at all like the tranquil picture of a father encircled by affection of his family rather than his house in Las Vegas turned into a chokehold battlefield where disagreements over inheritance and wills burst, like an endless Parkinson's illness, had stolen storms. Because of his might, Richard is reduced to a shadow of the former ruler of the pawn store, selling gold and silver with a sharp-tongued. He seldom ever got out of bed. His hands shook too much to grasp a pen, but his eyes were still sharp, putting. Anyone who ventured to cross his eye on Rick Harrison wasn't there in that space. He was no longer the loving son he was. A calculating figure is always included with piles of court records and a look that never abandoned his father's family. The point at which tensions broke out was when Rick was charged for deceiving when his father was at his weakest, on late 2018 evening. As Richard's consciousness diminished, Rick carried a packet of papers revising the will and requesting Richard's father to sign a witness. Later, a private nurse stated in court that Rick muttered, "This is," into his father's ear, "for the family's benefit, Dad." Richard was hesitant and tired, ultimately signed, maybe as a result of his lack of no longer possessed the strength to oppose. Rick's too were removed from the updated document. Siblings' rights to inherit, transferring, complete pawn ownership store and key resources into Rick's prohibits other family members from observing Richard without Rick's supervision, only became aware of the modifications. Following his passing, disputes sprang out in the hospital corridors, crowded with cries and tears when Rick was accused by his siblings of robbing a dying father of his heritage. The ambience of Richard's home expanded to such an extent that even the lawyers labored in silence, using only eyes to communicate. Rick externally composed and in charge of each meeting, but a maelstrom of guilt roared inside him. And disagreement, his manipulation wasn't. It was a desperate attempt to gain power alone. Try to ultimately demonstrate his value to a father who had never acknowledged him. When Richard permanently closed his eyes, he was surrounded by no family arms, only secrets and loneliness waiting to destroy and blow up all of Rick Harrison's admissions. In court wasn't merely a revelation that destroyed his reputation as a person, was burned, consuming what little. The Harrison family's remnants once, America has promoted it as a model of unity and kinship when Rick spoke the terrifying acknowledgement that he had terminated his. The courtroom wasn't just about the father's life. With gavels thumping in the background requesting order, it was stuffed with the sound of Corey's blood connections breaking. In the gallery, Rick's kid sat with his shoulders were shaking and his head was bent. "I'm grieving the loss of my grandfather. My entire household," he wrote in a devastating social media post following. His remarks during the trial went far into the affection of porn star supporters worldwide. Rick's siblings, who had been absent for a long time, of the spotlight came forward. Now, driven by a rage they were no longer able to avoid filing cases that caused. The Harrison family was previously viewed by the public as a sign of solidarity, had turned into a vicious. The elder brother of Rick from the legal war, Joseph, spearheaded the attack, charging Rick with elder mistreatment and manipulation in his final days. Richard's will, another lawsuit that their sister Sherry filed, attempted to reverse Rick's final will and testament, had coerced their dad into signing Abby, a nurse's testimony, confirming that Richard had lost his mental capacity. During the period, the courts became tragic battlefields, where siblings, who used to eat meals together, now turned to one another with a bitter adversaries. "Rick took our father and the tradition of the family," Joseph said to the media, his angry voice trembling. The lawsuits weren't simply about recovering resources, they were considering restoring Richard's reputation, which they believed had been deceived by his son in his weakest point. Outside of the porn star's empire collapsed in the courtroom, similar like a sandcastle in front of a rushing tide. The pawn shop that used to sell gold and silver, crowded with visitors waiting in queue for pictures, has become a frigid ghost town, with dirty shelves and staff working in broadcast outlets drew a porn in quiet. Stars from their sponsorship catalogues, sales were cancelled, and merchandise bearing Rick's likeness, from t-shirts to bobbleheads, were burned or discarded. Sold on social media by irate fans, the number cancel flooded Pawn Stars, the broadcasts together, with devastating remarks that I once believed to be the as. It turns out the ideal family was a Lee the fan base was once enthralled with. Every item's history has now turned, feeling duped behind their backs by the Rick's glittering facade. The legal ramifications threatened Rick, similar to a sentence in front of the official verdict. Prosecutors equipped with demands for confessions and court papers, the highest fine for phoning Rick's acts an irreparable betrayal, whilst his defense team pushed for forbearance, pointing to mental stress and the agony of never having earned his father's blessing. But in the perspective of Rick's family and the general public, both no longer the adored Pawn Star's hero, he had turned into a blood traitor, who destroyed not merely his father, but the very legacy that once connected them. As the TV lights went off, united dusk, all that was left was devastation and injuries that would never go away. To comprehend why Rick Harrison, once regarded as a representation of the American dream, had plunged into the depths of treachery, one have to examine the tormented heart behind his public persona smile. Rick was raised in a difficult, Richard Oldman Harrison's discipliner parent who is affectionate but unforgiving, and sets expectations such as steel barriers are not feasible. To overcome all of Rick's shortcomings was given a look, no matter how tiny, of disappointment that sowed the seeds of self-doubt would prevent him from ever uprooted. Despite having constructed the Pawn Rick of Star's empire, was still plagued by the impression that he was never decent, sufficiently longing for a moment of acknowledgement, a time his dad would never give. Experts in psychology examining Rick's confession defined the catastrophe as a classic instance of conflicting loyalty. Rick and his father adored the man who had taught him everything he needed to know about business, and hated the man who had held him captive. In every compliment is overshadowed by an enormous shadow. The public provided Richard with all rejection of Rick's concepts, fueled the. He was ripped by the fires of his mute wrath. Between his obligation as a devoted son and his desire to escape from his father's authority and turn into his own man, that oppressive sensation of being trapped, in addition to the crushing the demands of celebrity. And gradually, accountability turned Rick becoming unfamiliar with his own. The terrible thing that Conscience Rick did wasn't a brief tirade. It was the final stage of psychological injuries. He once had a dream that lingered for decades, when his father would give him a pat. "You are my pride," he said over his shoulder. But instead of that dream, a vicious in actuality, Richard never considered him a competent replacement that is in dire need of craving acceptance, never satisfied. In the end, Rick's moral boundaries became hazy, which told him to make a terrible choice that ruined not just his dad, but the family and his formerly profound legacy. The demise of beloved Rick Harrison is not merely a tale of a dysfunctional family. It serves as a sobering reminder of the negative aspects of actuality TV. Pawn Stars used to be enchanted, millions with a unified image. Harrison family, where antiques are treasured, told stories of dedication and diligence. But that illusion was shattered by the trial, revealing resentful disputes that have been hidden for a long time through meticulous realism editing and writing. TV, which once promised genuineness, has changed turned out to be just a carefully arranged mirage departing the public feels deceived by their heroes, disintegrated in front of their eyes. The narrative has evolved into a contemporary tragedy. Harsh evidence of the cost of betrayal and ambition took Rick away, in his desire for power and glory wrecked in addition to his father, that their family is a cultural icon in America, had evolved to stand for. The controversy raises a serious issue. Is family worth sacrificing for fame? The actual cost of living in the constant attention to the Harrison legacy. Previously a proud emblem, it now serves as acid reminder that even the most perfect families are also capable of hiding their flaws. Deep for this case to ever heal, it didn't just terminate a television program, it broke a national delusion that leaves a hard-earned lesson of morality, loyalty, and the fame's fragility. Rick Harrison's current existence as a single, imprisoned shadow, not just by the intimidating jail walls, but also by the public's and family's animosity. Same to the man who used to smile, Ben.